It was just another ordinary day for Shaquille O'Neal, a time to escape the usual hustle of his high-profile life. Dressed casually, no one recognized him as the larger-than-life basketball legend, Shaq. He walked into a McDonald's in a quiet corner of the city, his stomach growling with hunger after a long morning of business meetings and personal errands. The usual fanfare of being recognized wasn't there today, and he liked it that way. Sometimes, all a person wanted was a simple meal without the spotlight. Shaq stood in line, scanning the menu, and as he waited, he noticed the tranquility of the restaurant. It was relatively empty, with only a few scattered patrons. He made his way to the counter, ordering his usual, a Big Mac meal with extra fries and a Coke. The sounds of the soft music playing overhead, the hum of the fryer, and the occasional clink of the cash register filled the background. It was peaceful, an escape from the often chaotic life that came with fame. After paying for his meal, Shaq walked to a corner booth by the window, content to enjoy his food and the rare moment of solitude. He sat down, opened the paper bag, and pulled out the fries, glancing out the window as he took the first bite of his Big Mac. The sun outside was beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the glass. It was a peaceful scene, a brief escape from the demands of his everyday life. But that peace didn't last long. A soft tap on his shoulder interrupted his meal. Shaq turned, surprised, to see a young boy standing there. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 years old. His wide eyes were filled with both curiosity and something Shaq couldn't quite place, unease, maybe even fear. The boy hesitated for a moment, standing just slightly too close to Shaq's table. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said in a soft voice, barely above a whisper. Shaq blinked, still trying to process what was happening. He smiled warmly, instinctively putting down his burger. "Hey there, little man. What's up?" The boy's voice faltered as he took a deep breath. Are you really Shaq?" Shaquille O'Neal chuckled and nodded, his large frame seeming even bigger in the booth. "Yeah, that's me, Shaq. What's your name, buddy?" "Billy." The boy looked down at his shoes, his feet fidgeting nervously. He took another hesitant step forward and then whispered something so quietly that Shaq barely caught the words. "I need your help." At first, Shaq thought it might be a simple fan encounter, something he was used to. But there was something in the boy's demeanor, something about the way his small hands wrung together and his wide eyes avoided looking directly at him, that sent a small chill down Shaq's spine. This wasn't just a casual fan meeting. There was something more to this interaction. Shaq paused, studying the boy's face, trying to understand what was going on. The child's expression was a mix of fear and desperation, as though he was caught in a situation far too big for someone so young. Shaq felt a sense of concern creep into his thoughts. Before he could say anything, Billy leaned in closer and whispered again, "It's my dad. He's going to hurt my mom." A cold shiver ran down Shaq's spine as the words hit him. He could see the anxiety in the boy's eyes, the quiet plea for help that was now unmistakable. The usual fun and lightheartedness of a meal at McDonald's had vanished. This was something far more serious. Shaq's heart sank. What was happening? Why was a young child asking for help in a place like this? Shaq knew he had to act. This wasn't just a typical encounter. This was a cry for help. And Shaquille O'Neal wasn't someone who would turn a blind eye to it. As the boy stepped back, looking over his shoulder as if worried someone might be watching, Shaq's gaze shifted to the man sitting at a table nearby. Billy's father, or at least the man who Shaq presumed was his father, was watching them. The man had a cold, indifferent stare, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The tension between the boy and this man was palpable, as though there was something more at play here than just a father-son meal. Shaquille O'Neal sat in stunned silence, staring at the young boy before him. Billy, with his nervous demeanor, had just spoken words that left Shaq grappling with the weight of their significance. "It's my dad. He's going to hurt my mom." The innocence of the boy's face, fragile and young, belied the magnitude of what he was saying. Shaq couldn't help but notice how small Billy seemed in that moment, standing in front of a towering figure like himself. The contrast was jarring, yet it seemed to amplify the boy's vulnerability. His clothes were simple, a faded superhero t-shirt and a pair of scuffed jeans that looked too big for his slight frame. Billy's shoes, untied and worn, added to the image of a child who might not have a lot, yet carried a heavy burden for one so young. Billy's face was framed by messy, unkempt hair, a mix of light brown and dirty blonde strands that seemed to have a life of their own. His hair fell in uneven layers around his face, and a small cowlick at the back of his head made him look even younger than he probably was. His large, wide eyes were the first thing Shaq noticed, deep pools of brown that shimmered with something Shaq couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but there was something else there, too, an unspoken plea for help, as if Billy wasn't sure if he was allowed to ask for it, but couldn't keep it inside any longer. The boy's lips trembled slightly, as though the weight of his words had been too much for him to bear. Billy quickly wiped his eyes, as though trying to hide the tears that had started to form, though they hadn't yet spilled. His shoulders hunched forward in a subtle attempt to make himself appear smaller, to shrink into the background and avoid drawing attention. He was trying to be brave, but it was clear that the fear was overwhelming. Shaq's gaze flickered back to the father figure across the room, his cold eyes fixed on the interaction between the boy and the basketball legend. The man had not moved since Billy's whispered confession, his presence ominous in the way he hovered in the background, seemingly waiting for something. Shaq could see the stiffness in his posture, an unnatural stillness that was unnerving, almost as though the man was trying to will the situation into something different, to control the narrative before it could escape his grasp. But Shaq wasn't about to let that happen. "Hey, it's okay, kid. You're safe here. I'm gonna help you," Shaq said, his voice gentle but firm, trying to reassure Billy without overwhelming him. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them, offering a sense of security. Shaq's large frame loomed over the boy in a protective way, but he made sure to keep his tone soft, careful not to frighten him further. Billy's eyes darted to the side, seeking a moment of reassurance from the familiar face of his father. But the man didn't offer any comfort. His gaze was unwavering, his jaw clenched tight. There was an air of menace that lingered around him, as though he was a predator watching his prey. The tension in the room had shifted. Shaq could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. "Is your mom with you right now?" Shaq asked gently, trying to keep the conversation going, to draw Billy's attention away from the looming figure of his father. Billy nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "She's at home," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't want him to hurt her. I don't want her to get hurt." Shaq's heart ached at the sound of those words. He could see how much Billy cared for his mother, how deeply he was affected by the thought of her being harmed. Billy's small hands, trembling ever so slightly, balled into fists at his sides, as though he were trying to hold on to any semblance of control in a world that seemed to be spinning out of his reach. "Where's your mom right now, Billy? Is she alone at home?" Shaq asked, his instincts kicking in as the gravity of the situation sank in. The boy looked up at him with those wide eyes, still filled with that quiet desperation. "She's with him, but I don't think she knows he's mad. He gets really quiet when he's mad. He says things, bad things, and then he starts yelling, and she gets scared, but she won't tell me what's going on." The word stung, a cold wave of realization washing over Shaq. It was clear now, Billy wasn't just seeking attention or a simple conversation. He had come to Shaq with a plea for help, a cry to prevent something terrible from happening to his mother. The weight of the responsibility hit Shaq like a freight train. He had to do something, anything to help. Shaq leaned back in his booth, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the situation. The boy was in distress. His mother was at home with a volatile figure, and the father, who was now watching with an unnerving intensity, was likely the source of all this fear. But there was no denying the fact that Billy was here, right in front of him, in need of immediate intervention. And Shaq knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he could not just sit back and let this pass. He had made a promise to himself years ago that he would use his platform and influence to stand up for what was right, to be a force for good in the world. Now, that call to action was more real than ever. Shaq turned back to Billy, offering him a smile as reassuring as he could manage. "We're gonna get you out of here, buddy. You don't have to worry anymore." Billy nodded slowly, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Though it was clear that the boy wasn't entirely convinced, the fear still lingered, not just in his words, but in his body language. But for the first time since approaching Shaq, Billy seemed to feel a small sense of comfort. "Thank you," Billy whispered, his voice barely audible. But the gratitude in those two words spoke volumes. Shaq stood, his towering figure casting a shadow over the booth, as he took a moment to glance one last time at the father, who was still staring, unmoving. Shaq's expression hardened, a silent promise forming in his mind. He wasn't about to let this situation unfold any further without intervening. The silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the soft shuffle of Billy's feet as he shifted uneasily in front of Shaq. Every once in a while, his eyes flicked to the man standing a few paces behind him, Harris. There was something almost magnetic about the way Billy's gaze was drawn to the man, a mixture of fear and longing that painted a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Harris stood with a rigid posture, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowed in a way that made it difficult to read his emotions. He was older than Billy, of course, and his presence was commanding, not just physically but in the way he seemed to dominate the room without needing to say much. His dark, graying hair was neatly combed back, but his face, sharp and angular, showed the wear of years of authority, control, and something darker beneath the surface. Billy's discomfort was evident. The way he stood stiffly, shoulders tense as though he were preparing to flee at any given moment. His small frame seemed to shrink even further when Harris's eyes locked onto his, an unspoken command in that gaze that made Billy shrink away even more. The boy's hands, clenched into tight fists, were the only outward signs of the inner conflict swirling inside him. He didn't want to look up, but something about the presence of Harris made it impossible for him to look away for too long. In contrast, Harris stood like a statue, unflinching, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle at the side of his face twitched, an involuntary movement that betrayed the barely contained rage simmering just beneath the surface. His eyes darted over Billy's every movement, following him with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick, like it was charged with the potential for something to snap at any moment. Shaquille O'Neal watched the interaction, his instincts as a former athlete honed by years of playing in high-pressure situations. He could feel the volatility in the air, the tension that hung between the man and the boy. It was clear that Billy was caught in a dangerous emotional tug-of-war, torn between the fear he had for his father and a strange, almost desperate desire for approval. He wasn't just afraid of Harris. There was a deeper, more complicated bond between them, one that was built on a fractured relationship, a history that neither of them could shake. Harris's voice broke the silence with a low growl, his tone sharp and commanding, though it was undercut by an unmistakable edge of frustration. "Billy, you're making a scene. Stop this nonsense and get over here," he barked, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. His eyes never left Billy's face as he spoke, willing the boy to comply without hesitation. Billy flinched at the sound of Harris's voice, his body recoiling as though he had been physically struck. For a moment, it seemed as though the boy might comply, might move toward the man who had been a constant presence in his life. But then, just as quickly, Billy's feet shifted, a small step backward, and his eyes flickered toward Shaq, silently seeking solace in the giant's presence. I don't want to," Billy whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with the force of his resistance. The words were like a spark in the powder keg of the room, setting off a new wave of tension that seemed to ripple outward, suffocating everything around it. Harris's eyes darkened, his gaze turning icy as he glared at the boy. "What did you say to me?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The shift in his tone was immediate. Gone was the feigned calm, replaced by something raw and primal. Shaq could feel the heat radiating from Harris, the anger that was building beneath the surface. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was control, an iron fist hidden beneath layers of calculated coldness. Harris had been used to being in charge, and Billy's defiance was a direct challenge to that control. He was not used to being defied, especially not by his own son. Billy's body trembled slightly, and for a moment, Shaq wondered if the boy would crumble under the pressure. But then Billy stood tall, his shoulders set with a newfound resolve. The fear in his eyes was still there, but it was tinged with something more, a flicker of defiance. However small. "I'm not going with you," Billy said, his voice gaining strength despite the terror he must have felt. "I'm staying here." Shaq's heart clenched as he looked at the boy, who was standing his ground against a man who had the power to break him, emotionally and physically. It was clear that Billy had been through far too much already. Harris, on the other hand, didn't seem to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. He was so used to having the upper hand that Billy's simple refusal sent him into a fury. Without warning, Harris moved toward Billy with quick, purposeful steps, his hand rising as though to seize the boy by the arm and drag him away. Shaq was already on his feet, stepping forward just as quickly, positioning himself between the two. The shift was instantaneous. In that split second, Shaq's towering figure blocked Harris's path, a silent statement of his intent to protect Billy no matter the cost. "Back off." Shaq's voice was low and forceful, yet controlled. He didn't raise his hand to threaten Harris, but the presence of the basketball legend, his towering form and commanding voice, was enough to stop Harris in his tracks. Harris's eyes narrowed as they flicked to Shaq, sizing him up. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that stretched uncomfortably between two people who both knew that something big was about to happen. Then Harris, with a sneer curling at the corner of his lips, slowly took a step back. He didn't want to escalate the situation. Not yet. He still believed he could control Billy, and perhaps, by extension, he believed he could intimidate Shaq as well. "I'll be watching," Harris spat, his voice dripping with menace. He didn't need to say anything more. The threat was clear. Billy, still standing behind Shaq, seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. But he didn't flinch. The moment of danger had passed, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. The room fell into an unsettling stillness after Harris's threat, the air thick with unspoken words and the lingering tension that seemed to hang between Billy and his father. As the man retreated, his gaze burning with an unholy mixture of frustration and rage, Shaq found himself in a delicate position. He knew better than anyone the power of influence, the way a single gesture, a single word, could alter the course of a person's life. The towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal stood between Billy and Harris, the space between them acting as both a shield and a barrier. But there was more to it than just physical protection. Shaq's intervention was not just a matter of standing in the way. It was a choice to step into a situation that no one else had the strength to challenge. A decision to intervene when silence and inaction might have been the easier route. Billy stood behind him, still trembling slightly but now visibly relieved. There was something comforting about the giant's presence, something undeniably grounding. Shaq's towering figure wasn't just intimidating to Harris, it also provided Billy with a sense of safety, a protective aura that allowed him a brief respite from the chaos of his father's wrath. But Shaq was more than just a physical force in that moment. His presence was rooted in experience, in wisdom, and in the quiet understanding of what it meant to be a protector. For years, he had been a mentor, a leader, a father figure to many of those around him. It was never just about his physical dominance. It was about his emotional intelligence and his ability to understand the depths of a person's struggle, even when they couldn't voice it themselves. He had seen enough in his career, both on and off the basketball court, to know when someone needed saving, and more importantly, how to save them without making them feel weak or helpless. As Harris retreated, still muttering under his breath, Shaq took a step toward Billy. His voice, calm but firm, filled the space between them. "You okay, kid?" he asked, looking down at the boy with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the moment. Billy, still shaken but now facing the man who had stepped in to shield him, nodded silently. Shaq could see the fear in the boy's eyes, but there was something else too, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Billy wasn't the same kid he had seen moments ago, trapped under the weight of Harris's oppressive control. The boy had found his voice, even if it was only a whisper, and that gave Shaq hope. The intervention had been more than just about stopping an immediate threat. It was about giving Billy the courage to stand up, to understand that he didn't have to succumb to fear. He knelt down to Billy's level, his massive frame now lower, his eyes meeting the boy's. There was a deep kindness in Shaq's expression, an understanding that went beyond mere words. You don't have to go back with him, Billy. No one's going to make you. You're safe here, he said, his tone soft but certain. It was an offer of protection, of sanctuary, something that Billy had longed for but had never known how to ask for. Billy's gaze flickered between Shaq and Harris, his mind clearly racing. It was as though a battle raged within him, on one hand. The weight of years of conditioning, of his father's harsh control, telling him that obedience was the only option. On the other, a new sense of agency, a newfound realization that he had options, that he could choose a different path. But what if he? Billy's voice faltered, and for a moment, the vulnerability he had been holding back broke through. He wasn't just asking about Harris's anger. He was asking about the fear of stepping out from under the shadow of someone who had controlled his every move for so long. Shaq's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Billy's shoulder, his voice steady and confident. Look, kid, I've been in tough spots before. I've been the one who had to make the tough choice. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to be easy. But you have the power to make your own decisions now, and I'm here to help you through it. Billy's eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something new there too, a glimmer of hope, of trust. Shaq had stepped in not just to protect him physically, but to offer him a path forward, a way out of the maze of fear and uncertainty that had been his reality for far too long. Shaq turned slightly to glance over his shoulder, his eyes locking with Harris's for a moment. The tension between them was palpable, but Shaq's gaze was unwavering. He wasn't backing down. There was something about the way he held himself, with an unspoken authority, that told Harris he would not be intimidated. The exchange was silent, but it spoke volumes. Harris, ever the embodiment of control, might have believed he could break Billy, but Shaq had already shown him that there were forces at play that he couldn't manipulate. Billy, Shaq continued, his voice once again drawing the boy's attention. You're stronger than you think. You've got a lot inside you, a lot of heart, and that's something no one can take away from you, not even him. The boy's eyes welled up, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, a single tear slipped down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed, but Shaq saw the release of emotions that Billy had held back for far too long. Shaq didn't say anything about the tear. Instead, he gave Billy a knowing smile, one that said everything the boy needed to hear. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Shaq stood up, turning back to face Harris. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. Harris, looking less certain now than before, took a step back, his frustration evident, but not enough to push him into action. He didn't want to escalate things. Not in front of Shaq. The man had already shown that he wasn't someone to trifle with, and Harris wasn't about to risk further confrontation. As the tension in the room began to ease, Shaq turned to Billy, offering his hand with a kind smile. Come on, let's get out of here for a bit. You've had enough for today. Billy hesitated for just a moment before finally taking Shaq's hand, his small fingers curling around the giant's. There was a moment of unspoken understanding between them. Billy had taken a huge step forward, and Shaq had been the one to guide him. Together, they walked out of the room, leaving Harris behind in the wake of their quiet victory. The battle wasn't over, Shaq knew that. But today, at least, Billy had a chance to breathe, to think for himself, to know that there were people who cared enough to stand by him. As Shaq and Billy walked out of the tense atmosphere, there was an unspoken relief in the air. The immediate danger had passed, but both knew that the situation was far from resolved. Harris was not the kind of man to let things go easily, and the echoes of his threats still lingered in Billy's mind. But for now, there was an undeniable sense of safety, even if it was only temporary. Outside, the sounds of sirens grew louder, their wail piercing through the quiet as the flashing lights illuminated the darkening streets. The arrival of the police was both a comfort and a harbinger of what was to come. Shaq's towering figure led Billy toward the front door, his presence commanding enough to make those around him step aside. As they approached, the flashing red and blue lights bathed the neighborhood in a strobe-like effect, setting the stage for the next chapter of this tense encounter. The officers, a pair of seasoned veterans, stepped out of their patrol car and immediately took in the scene. One, a woman with short cropped hair and a stern expression, surveyed the yard as she approached the house. The other, a younger man who seemed eager but cautious, followed her closely, his hand instinctively resting near the holstered weapon at his side. "Shaquille," the female officer called out, recognizing the former basketball star immediately. "We got a call about a disturbance. What's going on here?" Shaq, turning slightly to face the officers, gestured for them to come closer. He was well aware that the arrival of the police meant that things were about to get much more complicated. But he remained calm and composed, just as he always had in moments of tension. His role had shifted from protector to witness, but he understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "There's been an altercation," Shaq explained briefly, his voice steady. "Billy here was in a tough spot, and we had to step in. His father, well, things got a little out of hand." He glanced down at Billy, who was now standing a few steps behind him, his face a mixture of relief and fear. The officers nodded, exchanging a look before the woman addressed Billy directly. "Billy, is it?" she asked, her tone soft but firm. "Can you tell us what happened here?" Billy hesitated, his gaze flickering between the officers and the ground. He wasn't used to speaking up, especially when it came to his father. But the events of the last few minutes had forced him into a position where silence was no longer an option. He knew he had to speak if he was going to find a way out, if he was going to make this moment count. With Shaq standing beside him, offering silent support, Billy took a deep breath and nodded. "My dad, he gets angry sometimes. Really angry. He said some things, threatened me." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions that had been building up inside him for so long. I don't know what to do anymore." The younger officer, who had been listening intently, nodded sympathetically. "We understand, Billy. That's why we're here. We'll take it from here." He motioned for the woman to step closer to the door, where Harris was still standing, watching from a distance but not daring to intervene. The female officer approached Harris with caution, her eyes narrowing as she took in his posture and demeanor. There was no mistaking the tension in the air, the underlying threat that Harris seemed to carry with him. The officer, well trained in de-escalation, kept her voice calm but authoritative as she addressed him. "Sir, we need to speak with you about what's been happening here. I'd like you to step outside." Harris's eyes flickered with defiance, but he knew better than to challenge the police directly. With a grunt, he complied, stepping onto the porch and facing the officers. His body language was still aggressive, but he seemed to be calculating his next move, waiting to see how far he could push before things went too far. "We've received multiple reports about a disturbance," the officer continued. "Billy has indicated that there was a threat made against him. We need to know your side of the story." Harris let out a sarcastic laugh, his hands shoved into his pockets as he leaned against the doorframe. "A threat? My son's just being dramatic. He's got a big imagination. I wasn't threatening him." The officer's eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, as she assessed his response. The tension was palpable, but her training had prepared her for these types of interactions. She knew how to spot the signs of manipulation, the subtle ways in which people like Harris could twist the narrative to make themselves seem less culpable. "Harris," the officer said, her tone sharp, "you can make excuses all you want, but threats are serious. We'll need to take a statement from you, and we're going to need to ensure Billy's safety. We're not going to leave him in a situation where he's afraid for his life." At this, Harris's demeanor shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He stepped forward, his body tense, but before he could say anything further, the other officer moved between him and the woman, his posture defensive but non-threatening. "Sir, we're asking you to cooperate," the younger officer said firmly, his hands still near his holster. "If you continue to resist, we'll have to take further action. This is your chance to make things right." Harris's eyes narrowed, but after a long moment of silence, he gritted his teeth and muttered under his breath, "Fine, but this isn't over." Shaq, standing a few feet away, remained calm, his presence unwavering. He had been through enough public confrontations to know that the situation wasn't over just because the police had arrived. In fact, it was just beginning. Billy, however, was starting to feel a sense of relief. With the police here, there was a glimmer of hope that things might finally be different, that someone else would take control and remove him from the situation he had felt trapped in for so long. The police began their investigation, speaking with both parties, taking statements, and gathering any evidence they could find. As they worked, the flashing lights continued to illuminate the scene, casting shadows across the yard and the porch, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Billy had taken his first step toward breaking free from the cycle of fear. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, the arrival of the police had given him something he hadn't had before: real, tangible hope that things could change. The next steps would be critical, but at least for now, Billy knew he wasn't alone. As the police continued their investigation, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Shaq, standing off to the side, kept a close eye on both Billy and the ongoing interactions with Harris. Every few moments, his gaze flickered to the doorway, where Billy's father stood, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Harris's posture was stiff, his jaw clenched in a way that suggested a brewing storm of emotions beneath the surface. He was angry, no doubt, but whether it was with Billy, the police, or the entire situation was unclear. What was certain, however, was that Harris wasn't going to let things unfold peacefully without a fight. Billy, still in the front yard under the watchful eye of the police, stood nervously with his head lowered. His mind raced with thoughts of the past, memories of growing up in fear and uncertainty. But as the investigation pressed on, something started to shift in the young man's heart. A fragile hope that had been buried for years began to emerge. With the police taking control of the situation, with Shaq there offering support, Billy realized that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. The female officer, who had been questioning Harris, suddenly stepped back, holding up a small piece of evidence, something that had been found just outside the house. It wasn't something that could be ignored. The look on her face was one of grim realization, and she motioned to the younger officer, who immediately walked over to Billy and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Billy, we need to talk," the officer said softly. "We've found something that's going to help us understand everything that's been happening here." Billy's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of the officer's words, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of courage surge through him. With a deep breath, he nodded, following the officer toward the side of the house. Shaq, ever the vigilant protector, stayed close by, offering a reassuring presence as they walked. "I don't know how much more I can say," Billy whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Everything just feels like it's been building up for years. I don't even know where to begin." The officer nodded, his expression softening. "We're here for you, Billy, and we want to get to the truth, whatever that may be. Just know that you're not alone in this anymore." As Billy looked over at Shaq, he felt a sense of solidarity, a bond forged through shared moments of tension and understanding. The former basketball star wasn't just an icon. He was a real person who cared about him. And that realization was enough to push Billy to do something he had never dared before: speak his truth. Back at the front door, the female officer had taken the piece of evidence into her hands, examining it carefully. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, a list of names and phone numbers, some of which appeared to be addresses. But what stood out most of all were the words scribbled in the margin: "Make sure Billy learns his place. No one leaves without paying." The officer's brow furrowed as she took a second look at the paper. This wasn't just a minor family dispute. It was something darker, something far more dangerous. As the officer's mind raced, she knew she needed to get a full statement from Billy and his mother. They had to know what was really going on inside that house. Harris's face darkened as he watched the officer approach him again, the evidence now in her hand. His hands twitched slightly, and his eyes narrowed with a hint of desperation. It was clear to the officers that the tension in the air was rising, but they couldn't let it escalate further. "This is just a misunderstanding," Harris grumbled, trying to brush off the situation with a wave of his hand. "I don't know what you think you're seeing, but Billy's a liar. He's always been dramatic. That paper doesn't mean anything." The female officer, however, was unyielding. "Sir, This paper clearly links you to a pattern of behavior that goes beyond what we were told. We've heard from multiple sources that your relationship with Billy has been abusive, and now we have physical evidence that supports those claims. For a brief moment, Harris faltered. His face twitched, and he opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The jig was up. No more lies. No more manipulation. It was as if a mask had slipped off, revealing the truth beneath the surface, something that no longer could be hidden or ignored. The younger officer, who had been listening to the exchange, turned toward Billy. "Billy, we need to talk to your mother. Is she here? We need to make sure she's safe." 2. Billy felt his stomach churn with a mix of dread and relief. He had been so focused on the immediate danger of his father's anger that he had forgotten about his mother. She had been the quiet observer for far too long. But now it seemed like the time had finally come for her to be freed from the toxic grip of Harris's control. With a hesitant voice, Billy spoke up. "She's inside. She's been hiding, trying to stay out of the way. I think she's afraid of him, just like I am." The officer nodded and motioned for the other to follow. Together, they made their way to the door, where Harris still stood, attempting to regain his composure. But now, it was clear to everyone that his reign of intimidation was over. His facade was crumbling, and the truth was finally coming to light. As the officers entered the house, they found Billy's mother sitting in the living room, visibly shaken but composed. Her eyes widened as she saw the police officers enter, and for a moment, she seemed uncertain whether to be relieved or terrified. The officers, though, knew what had to be done. The truth was out, and it was time to make sure both Billy and his mother were safe from harm. The female officer, speaking gently but with authority, addressed Billy's mother. "Ma'am, we're here to help. We've gathered evidence that your son has been in danger, and we want to make sure that you're safe as well." Billy's mother looked up, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. For years, she had kept quiet, afraid to speak out, too scared to leave the man she had married. But now, with the police here, the weight of the truth seemed to wash over her, and a small, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't want this to happen," she said softly. "I didn't want him to go through this, but I was too scared. I didn't know what to do." The officer gave her a reassuring nod. "It's okay. You don't have to worry anymore. You and Billy are safe now." For the first time in years, Billy felt the heavy burden of fear lift off his shoulders. The truth was out, and he and his mother were no longer alone. As the officers worked to secure the house and gather further details, Billy and his mother stood side by side, a quiet understanding passing between them. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had taken the first crucial steps toward freedom. Shaq, standing outside with the other officers, felt a sense of pride in what had just transpired. He knew it wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead for Billy and his mother. But in this moment, he couldn't help but feel that justice had been served. The truth had come to light, and for the first time in a long time, Billy had a chance at a life free from fear. The events that transpired that day at McDonald's would go on to change Billy's life forever. But they would also ignite a fire in Shaquille O'Neal, leading him to embark on a campaign that would touch countless lives. What began as an unexpected intervention to protect a child from an abusive situation turned into a mission to raise awareness about domestic violence and ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. Shaquille O'Neal, known for his larger-than-life presence both on and off the basketball court, took the role of an advocate with the same dedication that had made him a star. He wasn't just a basketball legend or a pop culture icon anymore. He was a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. Billy's story, though tragic, wasn't unique. Too many children were living in fear. Too many parents were trapped in toxic, abusive relationships, and too many people had no idea where to turn for help. With the abuse that Billy had endured now uncovered, and Harris behind bars, Shaq knew it was time to do more than just offer a moment of protection. He had to make sure that these stories no longer stayed hidden in the shadows. The campaign he launched was aptly named Voices for the Voiceless, a movement dedicated to bringing awareness to the signs of domestic abuse, providing resources for those in need, and fostering a culture of empathy and intervention. Shaq partnered with local shelters, national organizations, and even government bodies to ensure that those who needed help had somewhere to turn. From the beginning, Shaquille used his platform to shine a light on this critical issue. Social media, interviews, and public appearances became a stage for him to speak out, raising awareness of the warning signs of domestic abuse and encouraging bystanders to take action when they saw something wrong. He emphasized the importance of not staying silent when a child or partner is in danger. The campaign took on a multifaceted approach. Shaq didn't just talk about the problem. He worked hard to provide tangible solutions. The initiative offered financial assistance for families in need, partnered with domestic violence shelters to create safe spaces for victims, and provided legal aid for those looking to escape abusive relationships. He even spearheaded educational programs in schools, teaching children how to recognize abuse and where to seek help. As the campaign gained traction, it wasn't just about spreading awareness. It became a movement for empowerment. Shaquille O'Neal traveled across the country, speaking at events and encouraging others to join the cause. The campaign reached beyond the physical and emotional boundaries of those affected. It encouraged society as a whole to be more compassionate, more alert, and more involved in the fight against domestic violence. The momentum built around Voices for the Voiceless was unstoppable. Community members, celebrities, and even other athletes joined the movement, each adding their voice to the growing chorus calling for change. Shaq's involvement meant that the issue of domestic violence was no longer just a quiet tragedy. It was now a mainstream conversation. But what truly set Shaq apart was his deep commitment to ensuring that those impacted by abuse had the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. He personally visited shelters, met with survivors, and offered them both financial and emotional support. His genuine empathy and willingness to connect with people on a personal level created a ripple effect throughout the community, inspiring others to take action and contribute in their own ways. One of the most powerful symbols of the campaign was the Voices for the Voiceless Gala, a star-studded event that Shaq organized to raise funds and honor those who had shown incredible strength in the face of abuse. The night was filled with stories of survival, hope, and the resilience of the human spirit. But it was also a reminder that, for every person who had been helped, there were many others still in need of support. It was a reminder that there was still work to be done. As the campaign continued to grow, one of its most touching moments came when Billy, now living in a safe environment with his mother, was honored for his bravery. The young boy, who had been too afraid to speak out just months earlier, stood before a room full of people and shared his story. The courage in his voice, at such a young age, left no one in the room untouched. Billy's resilience became a symbol of hope for so many others who felt powerless. He was given the Courage of the Year award for his bravery in coming forward, and his story was shared with the world to remind everyone that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. Shaquille O'Neal, ever the humble giant, used the opportunity to remind the audience that the real heroes were the survivors of abuse, the ones who had fought and overcome unimaginable obstacles. However, he also took the time to honor the ones who stood by them, who had the courage to step in when they saw someone in need. This moment underscored his belief in collective action, how every person has the power to make a difference, whether big or small. The community response to the campaign was overwhelming. People from all walks of life joined the effort, some sharing their own stories of survival, others volunteering their time and resources to help. Shaquille O'Neal's commitment to this cause had sparked a nationwide movement, proving that when a community comes together to support its most vulnerable, real change is possible. As the campaign continued to expand, the real impact began to show. Families were being reunited, children were growing up free from fear, and abusive cycles were being broken. But more importantly, the message that Shaquille O'Neal had championed, that it's never too late to stand up, to speak out, and to change the future, had inspired a new generation of advocates. Billy, who had once been a small voice in a chaotic world, had now become an emblem of hope. Through Shaquille's unwavering commitment, the campaign continued to thrive, helping not just Billy, but countless others find their way to safety and strength. The power of one person stepping up, one voice joining a chorus, had created something extraordinary. And as the campaign grew, Shaq's message remained simple but profound. We all have a voice, and we all have a responsibility to use it for good. In the end, it wasn't just about saving Billy. It was about saving every child, every parent, and every person who found themselves in an abusive situation. It was about creating a world where silence was no longer an option, and where hope was always within reach. The night of the Voices for the Voiceless Gala arrived with a sense of anticipation and reverence that filled the air. The room, elegantly decorated with warm lights and soft hues, buzzed with conversations from advocates, survivors, and supporters of the campaign. Celebrities, philanthropists, and activists all gathered under one roof, united by a single purpose: to honor those who had shown extraordinary courage in the face of adversity. But tonight, the focus was on a young boy, Billy, whose bravery had become the cornerstone of a movement. His story, one that had begun in fear and silence, had evolved into a beacon of hope for countless others. The evening was not just a celebration of survival, it was a celebration of courage, of standing up when the world seemed too dark to make a difference. And at the center of it all was Billy, the young hero whose voice had sparked a nationwide conversation about domestic abuse. As the ceremony began, Shaquille O'Neal took the stage, his towering figure radiating warmth and authority. The applause that followed was thunderous, a recognition not just of his fame, but of his tireless efforts to change the lives of those affected by domestic violence. Shaq, ever the gracious giant, gestured for the crowd to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is not about me," Shaq began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "It's about the people who need our help the most. It's about those whose stories have too often gone unheard. And tonight, it's about one very special young man, Billy." The audience fell silent, the spotlight turning toward the stage as Billy, standing hand in hand with his mother, made his way up to the podium. The room, filled with people from all walks of life, watched with a mixture of admiration and awe. The young boy, who had once been afraid to speak, now stood tall and proud, ready to share his truth with the world. Shaquille, his voice full of compassion, continued, "Billy's courage is something we all should learn from." When he spoke up, he gave a voice to so many others who are still too afraid to say anything. He showed us all that the power to change our lives is within our own hands, and that it only takes one voice to make a difference. Billy's mother, who had been through her own traumatic journey, smiled through her tears as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. It was clear that, while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they had both found strength in their bond, in the support of those around them, and in their shared resilience. Tonight, they were not just survivors, they were warriors. The audience stood, applauding as Billy took the microphone. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the room's expectations settling on his small shoulders. But then, with a deep breath, he began. "Thank you for helping me and my mommy," Billy said, his voice steady despite the nerves that tugged at him. "I'm scared sometimes, but I know that I'm safe now. I know my mom is safe too." The simplicity and purity of his words struck a chord with everyone in the room. His voice, though small, was filled with power. It was a voice that had once been silenced by fear, but now it resonated as a symbol of hope and bravery. His words reminded everyone that the most profound changes often come from the youngest among us, those who are still finding their way in the world but are capable of seeing it for what it truly is, both beautiful and broken. As Billy finished, the room erupted in applause once more. His courage was undeniable, his strength unshakable. The audience stood to honor him, and in that moment, the recognition was more than just an award, it was a promise. A promise that Billy's bravery would never be forgotten, that his story would inspire generations to come, and that no child would ever have to face abuse in silence again. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the Courage of the Year award, an honor that recognized Billy's bravery and his role in helping to bring attention to the issue of domestic violence. Shaquille handed the beautiful trophy to Billy, who held it with both hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and humility. As Billy accepted the award, Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is for you, Billy, but this is also for all the children who are too afraid to speak out. This is for all the mothers who feel trapped in their homes. And this is for everyone who has the courage to stand up for what's right." The crowd, moved by the sincerity of the moment, applauded once more. The energy in the room was electric, full of gratitude, empowerment, and hope. And while the ceremony was a celebration of Billy's courage, it was also a reminder that the work was far from over. The fight against domestic violence and abuse would not be won in a single night, nor by the actions of a single person. It would take a collective effort, a community, a movement, a nation, coming together to ensure that every child, every parent, every person had the resources and the support they needed to escape the grip of violence. In the midst of the applause, Shaquille took the stage once more, his voice now carrying a deeper, more resolute tone. Tonight, we celebrate Billy, but we also make a promise to ourselves, to each other, and to the world. We promise that we will continue to fight, continue to raise our voices, and continue to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. His words echoed in the room as the audience listened intently, fully aware that the journey was just beginning. I've seen firsthand how one voice can spark a revolution. I've seen how the smallest act of kindness can change the world. And tonight, we are all part of something bigger than ourselves. We are part of a movement that says no more. No more silence. No more fear. No more abuse. Shaquille's message was simple, yet powerful. It is up to us to create a world where abuse is not tolerated, where the voices of the voiceless are heard, and where every person can live in safety and dignity. The night came to a close with a call to action, an invitation to everyone in the room, and everyone watching from afar, to join the movement. The Voices for the Voiceless campaign wasn't just about raising awareness. It was about creating lasting change. It was about ensuring that no one had to suffer in silence, that no child had to live in fear, and that no person had to endure the pain of abuse without hope. As the final applause rang through the room, Shaquille O'Neal looked out at the sea of faces and knew that, in that moment, something truly transformative had taken place. Billy had started a wave of change, and it was only the beginning.